of the natural history. We've been talking about the cultural history. But Anne quite rightly, of course, said that one of the most amazing things about both our country and about Banks Peninsula, the Takapūneke, is that people came here so recently. And what I want to talk about, if I was listening to what Anne was saying, I'd have to go back 80 million years. And I said to Victoria, how long have I got? And she said, about 5 minutes. And I said, maybe I should only go back about 9 million years. Is that about what should be done? Anne also mentioned one of my favourite whakatauki, the proverbs, the wise sayings that we've all inherited, Māori and Pākehā, have inherited this amazingly rich heritage because of the treaty. I'm allowed to think of it as my heritage also. One of my favourite whakatauki of all time is the one that she referred to. It goes, toi tu he whenua, whatu ngaro ngaro he tangata. And directly translated simply means the land is forever and people disappear. But I really like the translation where it says, the land alone endures, people vanish. And of course, as Anne said, we've only been here for 800 years or so, at the most. And going back 9 million years sort of puts it into perspective a little bit, I think. So what I want to just quickly do is to give you a few snippets of this natural background to which all this is taking place. And there's a few misconceptions about it. One of the misconceptions is how Akaroa Harbour was formed, because I came over on the bus, not on my bike, I have to admit, 2 days ago from Christchurch, and the bus driver said that here was this volcano, which he was quite correct about, started erupting about 9 million years ago, the Akaroa volcano. Already off to the west, the Littleton volcano and the Mount Herbert volcano had been busily erupting, but Akaroa started about 9 million years ago, and it erupted just off and on for about 1 million years, building up this immense cone up to about 1,800 metres high, probably. But it was erupting at a time when New Zealand had a much, much warmer climate, which is interesting to what we're going through now. And nearly all of it was low-lying. And so the high ground of Akaroa volcano was one of the very, very few upland areas that New Zealand had. Otherwise, we were a very low-lying, very warm archipelago of very separated islands, totally different to what Aotearoa is now. That volcano erupted. And what I was told in the bus was that then there was one enormous, huge explosion. It blew the top off it, and the sea rushed in, and then we hit Akaroa Harbour. Well, ecology and geology are always more complicated than that. What happened, of course, was that the volcanic activity spluttered to a close. Amazingly enough, further west, back to where the other volcanoes erupted, the last volcanic activity was about 5.8 million years ago. I think that's the most recent sort of figure, which is still quite a long time ago. But in the meantime, Akaroa volcano extinct was beginning to erode away, and all the pattern of bays and harbours and streams that we see now was probably first of all imposed on the actively erupting volcano. One of the biggest streams was draining down and eroding away the erodible parts of the centre of the volcano, of Akaroa volcano. Onawe is actually, we believe, maybe if it's not the main vent of the Akaroa volcano, it's certainly one of the main vents. And the reason why it's sticking out there still is because it was a vent, and deep inside the volcano, these rocks were cooling very slowly. So they formed complete same chemical composition, but completely different forms with big crystals. They're called plutonic rocks because they cooled down very, very slowly deep within the sort of volcanic cone. And they're very unerodable, those hard, big crystal rocks. So that's sticking out there still. With all the erosion that went on, Onawe is still sticking out as a prominent feature, geologically as well as for all the other reasons as well. But then, long after the volcano became extinct, and while the erosion was taking place and deepening the streams, the whole Earth entered this bizarre and amazing. It wasn't the first time it happened, but it entered a whole series of ice ages, the Pleistocene ice ages. And there's numerous ice ages. For thousands of years, the climate was cold, and then for all sorts of reasons, but largely correlated with the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. We've got warm periods, some of them even warmer than now. Well, in the cold periods, the sea level around Banks Peninsula and around the whole of Aotearoa went down as low as 130 metres lower than it is now. And erosion carried on. You can imagine that the big valley that became Akaroa Harbour eroded more and more deeply because the baseline was 130 metres lower than it is now. At the same time, you know, we didn't have a coastline where we've got it now. We had to go at about another 45 kilometres out along what we like to call a continental shelf. I think we can call ourselves a continent. Zealandia is a continent, even though some people don't think we're all that big. But it was 45 kilometres off to the east. The whole valley of Akaroa Harbour was eroded more deeply, and then when the climate warmed again, the last glaciation sort of peaked about 18,000 years ago. Geologically, that's absolutely nothing. About 14,000 years ago, the glaciers all over the world began to retreat, but with geologically enormous speed, not nearly as fast as what's happening to the ice in the world at the moment from anthropogenic causes, but the ice did retreat. The sea level came up, and it wasn't this enormous explosion the sea rushed in. After all those millennia and millennia, the sea just rose up gently and flooded this deepened valley. That's Akaroa Harbour. In the meantime, the whole landmass became greatly lowered from about 1,800 metres, the highest peaks around Akaroa Harbour now. The highest one is Saddle Hill. I forget the modern name for Saddle Hill, I should remember it, but I can't. But it's about 860 metres. The highest peak on Hinawai, which is right behind Akaroa town, is Takapūneke, or Stony Bay Peak. It was much more recently called. And that's 806 metres, which juts into the present subalpine zone, but is not nearly as high as 1,800 metres. There never was ice on Banks Peninsula as far as you know. The mountains were never high enough and the climate cold enough for glaciers to form, but you can see what huge impact that the glaciers had. Here's another misconception, if I can mention it. Again, on the bus, I think a lot of people think that Banks Peninsula is naturally grassy and even dry and open. But in fact, of course, as Rick, you mentioned, I would have loved to have been on one of those first waka coming into Akaroa Harbour 800 years ago, whatever it was. Well, people were coming down from the north as well, but the first people to see Banks Peninsula and Akaroa Harbour, they would have seen it forested from side to side and from top to bottom. There are plants that are adapted to open habitats, but they were so limited, just to very steep bluffs, of which there were plenty, temporary things like landslides, very, very rare natural fires, almost all caused, well, by volcanism it would have, but long after the volcano was extinct, there were fires caused by lightning in very dry conditions, but it's quite hard to burn mature native forest on the Banks Peninsula. There's some estimates on any one point, so we're sitting right here in a forested place about 1,000 years ago, the likelihood of another fire happening was about 1 in 1,000 years. And it's amazing because you look at one of the misconceptions that people got here before the Polynesian explorers did, that's sometimes said, isn't it? But all the scientific evidence is absolute. Anyone who arrived here, even if they just came and went away again, as you said about the Chinese and the Spanish and all sorts of things, that all the scientific evidence just, there's absolutely no ecological impact from any human contact until the Kupe arrived in the north, and then the planned settlement, because that's another misconception. As a child in New Zealand school, I was taught, this is genuine, I was taught that the Polynesian discovery and settlement of New Zealand was accidental. The only word for that is bullshit. Am I allowed to say that? There's absolutely no evidence for accidental discovery, but there's every evidence for purposeful boying out 2,000 years ago, leaving the southern highlands of Taiwan into this hugest ocean in the world, purely for discovery. They weren't blown off course in the Pacific Ocean, for heaven's sake. And then Kupe, after he went back, he didn't come back again, I don't think, but he told everybody back in Hawaii that there was an amazing, cool, high land to the south, large and interesting, and there was planned settlement. And as I understand it, there would have been to and fro between Hawaii and Aotearoa, possibly for 200 years or so, but then by the time a big civilization had been built here, and a whole cultural history of a couple of centuries, there was no need to go back to Hawaii. They still knew about it, but there was no need to travel backwards and forwards. So that's another misconception. But the misconception it was an open, grassy place is just completely wrong too. Mostly covered in Potocarp hardwood forest, but some of you may know that in this corner and overlapping into the basin itself, the Akaroa basin itself, there was beech forest as well, only in the southeast corner of Banks Peninsula. And I'm enormously privileged to live right in the middle of that beech distribution on Banks Peninsula because of some of our loveliest forest on Hinawai's old growth red beech, hundreds of year old trees. Not just scattered trees, but forming cathedral-like forests. It's just, many of you will be familiar with that, and it's fantastic. But again, that was what was hinted at, all that pre-human history on Banks Peninsula. This is the last temperate landmass of any significant size at all to be settled by our species, by Homo sapiens. And it was settled by what I regard as the greatest navigators in the world. You know, some of us with a European ancestry or whakapapa, we like to think sometimes it's expressed that the Vikings were the greatest navigators in the world. They were crossing what was comparatively a ditch. This is the South Pacific. So there is no comparison. Again, another misconception, if I may say, is that the Māori arrived with amazing conservation principles and they had almost no impact on the ecology of Aotearoa. And that again is nonsense. We're basically all the same, we have the same needs. Any people arriving here, it doesn't matter what colour their eyes were, or their skin, or their hair, or whether they spoke any sort of language at all. We all have a similar effect, and of course the impact is big. On Banks Peninsula alone, in the Akaroa Basin in particular, about 1/4 to a third of the forest cover was removed during our several hundred years of pre-Pākehā colonisation. And a lot of birds became extinct, all the roa, the giant eagle, the adzebill, the owlet nightjar, the stout-legged wrens, all those became, the ducks, the swans, they all became extinct in Polynesian times. And I'm not apologising for that, just to get more than I'm apologising for what my ancestors did. But that's what happened. And then I think in Māori times, what happened is that they saw things were being lost, some major resources. We had to get a bigger protein resource in moa wandering around through the east. And a very, very profound conservation ethic was built up. When the European settlers, my ancestors, arrived, they exploited in a big way, and they slowly built up we are building up a conservation ethic because we haven't got a good enough one yet. But when Europeans arrived, sailing into Akaroa Harbour, it was largely forested still. Over on the west side of Banks Peninsula, it was what looked to the European botanists, it looked naturally open and grassy. But in fact, over on this side of Banks Peninsula, it was still a largely forested landscape, and there's some beautiful descriptions in whalers' guides and visitors from Europe and other places just saying what it was like. And you want to read some of those, they're just absolutely beautiful. But also in those accounts are huge fires that filled the Akaroa Basin with smoke for days on end. We've seen this sort of thing. We've got the Australian bush smoke coming over at the time of COVID, I think it was, wasn't it? 2000, whatever it was, 20, something like that. And a little bit earlier we saw those huge Indonesian fires that were filling a large part of Southeast Asia with what they politely called the haze. So it was actually just bushfire smoke. And within European time, within about, it wasn't instant, but within about 70 years, they had destroyed almost all of the old growth forest of Banks Peninsula, so that by 1900 there was less than 1% of the old growth forest left. In 1920, they were still milling some of those tiny remnants, and even more recently there's an article in Akaroa Mail about the milling Berlin's bush over in the northern Stony Bay. It's fortunately a remnant of that remains, but the Akaroa Mail article suggested it was going to disappear altogether, and that lovers of native forest would be disappointed because this was really the last low altitude segment of old growth forest that was left. So now from our detailed studies, we sort of measure that about 0.7 of 1% of the forest of Banks Peninsula that remains. But that's the bad news. The good news is that even while that forest was being destroyed, nature wasn't, Takapūneke and Tāne weren't putting up with that at all. And all the time the forest was, you might say, just itching to get back. And by 1900, when there was less than 1% of old growth forest left, There would have been a lot of regenerated with bracken, for example. There was Caposmus, small-leaf Caposmus, and silver tussock, and fescue tussock, and higher up snow tussock was occupying all this ground that had previously been forest, and the overall sort of successional trend, talking botanically, is that it goes back into forest again. And even with everything militating against it, that's what's been happening. So that now we know that there's about 17% of Banks Peninsula, 17, not 1.7, 17% of Banks Peninsula is covered in native forest, but still only 0.7 of 1% is old growth forest. So the figures are still pretty drastic. The bad news on the bird front, for example, because birds are what most people, there's all sorts of things, of course, there's lizards and insects and fish and all sorts, but the bird front means that we've lost about 1/2 of the breeding land birds from Banks Peninsula since 800 years ago, since the first arrival of Homo sapiens on Aotearoa. But the good news is there's half left, so and the ones that are left are thriving. The one that wasn't mysterious enough, as you know, was a tui. It was never extinct on Banks Peninsula. That's another misconception. Even when people were saying, oh, the tui is locally extinct on Banks Peninsula, we were still seeing perhaps 1 or 2 a year, maybe just 1 or 2 wandering males, so that it was perhaps functionally extinct. But nevertheless, they were here. But as you know, we had against my principles, to be honest, because I would much rather just let the habitat get better and better, and the tui would have come back on its own. So the good news is that the birds that have been left, they're reasonably resilient, believe it or not, against all the mammalian predators, and that's another slight misconception too. The worst mammalian predator of the lot we've got, apart from Homo sapiens himself, is our rats, which are such a fellow traveller with human beings all over the world. I just cannot believe if there's people on Aotearoa there will be rats. I honestly think that's the fact, and hopefully I'll be proved wrong and pest-free New Zealand will get it right, but rats are the big problem. On Hinawai, the birds that, even with a predator load of stoats and ferrets and wildcats and weasels and hedgehogs, because the habitat's getting better and better, the birds are increasing beautifully. Pipipi, a bird some of you may not have heard of, the brown creeper, is super abundant on Hinawai and in other parts of Banks Peninsula too. Tomtit, the South Island tomtit, was rare when we arrived only 37 years ago on Hinawai, and it's abundant. It's just, Hinawai is saturated with tomtits, with all the stoats and ferrets and rats and mice and the lot still. So ecology is complicated, but that's the good news. The ecology is not only complicated, ecology is also incredibly resilient, and we're chucking things at Papatuanuku now that are close to pushing her to desperation. Even if we get pushed off ourselves, nature will just get on with doing something, healing something, but it might not be with us, it may be without us, and hopefully it is with us, and that's what we've got to learn, isn't it? We just have to learn that we're just a part of nature, and not apart from nature. We're not in dominion, whatever the Bible says, we're not in dominion over nature. We're just a tiny part of nature, one of her most bizarre creations, really. The good news is that if just managed a little bit, just by taking the deleterious things away from what's caused, we're not having massive clearance of native forest anymore. We are, for example, having clearance of kānuka, which quite rightly some farmers who want to have pastoral grassland want to get rid of so they can keep their grass. But everywhere it's not important to keep grass, or it's not economic to keep grass, now what we've got to do is just try and enable nature to put back the forest again, and every bit of land which we really, really, really don't need to produce our own direct food or whatever. That's the hope that I see for the future. Although even if we covered every inch of the world and that was capable of growing forest, it wouldn't make much of a difference to the stupidity of continuing to burn fossil fuels. That's carbon that's been fossilised and sequestered for millions and millions and millions of years. How can just covering this limited area of land that we've got left that could grow forest, how can that possibly measure? What we've got to do, the most important to do, is just slightly change our ridiculous consumerist lifestyles, but we've also got to start living in harmony with nature. We've got to value every part of nature. This biodiversity is just, it's everything of what we are. Toi tue whenua whatu ngāra ngāra he tangata. It's a lesson that is so deep and important that let's hope we can do it.